Hello, a very warm welcome to you if you stumbled upon this video because you've been searching for something on the Enneagram in the YouTube channels. I've done quite a lot of stuff on the Enneagram, and I've taught a course last year which isn't available publicly on the YouTube videos, but was through the Edinburgh International Centre for Spirituality and Peace. And I'm constantly working on and developing this as my understanding and knowledge of the Enneagram and what it's all about increases through wider reading and through experience. But anyway, I've just had my 77th birthday. I thought it'd be a good chance to update people with what's going on, because I've been a bit silent on the matter recently. And the reason for that is because of more extensive reading and research. But I first got interested in the Enneagram many years ago, and most people know of the Personality Enneagram, which is actually been sadly misused by most people as a sort of typing tool. It's not meant to be a tool for putting people in boxes of personality types, but it's a map, if you like, for a process of transformation and growth so that you can become much more fully who you were created to become, or potentially can become, as a human being. The sort of higher version of yourself, if you like, freed from the ego personalities, passions and the fixations of the personality, which the Personality Enneagram talks about. But because there's been so much written about that, and some very excellent online courses, you have to pay a little bit usually for them, quite a bit actually, but there are some very good quality and well qualified people out there, people like Russ Hudson, Jessica Dibb, Beatrice Chestnut and Urania Pays, Helen Palmer, Almas, what's his name? Anyway, there's lots of people that have written very well on this. So I didn't want to duplicate what they've done probably better than I could do, because they've got more experience. So that's why I started reading the original works of Gurdjieff, who introduced the Enneagram symbol to the West in 1915 in St. Petersburg to a small group of people. And I first came across his teachings through the writings of somebody called Peter Uspensky, P.D. Uspensky, in this book. Peter is in Russian it's something different, but it's Peter translation. And he was one of the first followers of Gurdjieff, and spent many, many years with him, working with him collaboratively, until they finally separated, I think in the early 1920s, somewhere around about then. But anyway, Uspensky took detailed notes of all Gurdjieff's lectures and teachings, both the public lectures and also the teaching that he gave to his own sort of small group of followers. And so this contains it. It's a difficult read, because a lot of quite, how can I say, esoteric takes on metaphysics and the understanding of the universe, which you may not agree with. That doesn't matter. It helps to understand what Gurdjieff was talking about, where he was coming from. And of course, Gurdjieff was quite interested in science. He was scientifically trained as well, as a doctor, physician, as well as a priest. But it was the science of the 1915 to 1940s time, you know. And anyway, that's where I first came across it. And then I decided to read the original books by Gurdjieff himself, which are not easy either, because Gurdjieff didn't speak in English, or he spoke some English, but he wasn't fluent, had a strong accent. And he wrote in Russian, because he was a fluent Russian speaker. And this is his major opus, where he really explains in depth about everything that he's talking about. And he calls this book, it's Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which is an interesting title in itself. And then it's about all and everything, which it just about is true, all and everything, hence how thick it is. But really it is in the format of a science fiction novel, very clever indeed. A lot of difficult words because he consistently uses neologisms. That's the new words which he invents for the concepts he's trying to get across, particularly about the law of three and the law of seven, which he calls heptaparaparsenik, I think it is, something like that. But anyway, I can't remember exactly. But so he also writes satirically, so he has a good dig at what I would call traditional religion, orthodox religion. His knowledge and stuff, he claimed, came from esoteric Christianity, but it was also rooted in Sufi traditions, which I will go on to talk about a bit later. But so I read that. I've read it twice to try and get a hold of it. I need to read it once more, I think. And then I went on to read books written by other authors, and I started putting the course together. Since last time I did the course, however, I have been reading J.G. Bennett's Dramatic Universe. He's got 4 volumes here. John Bennett was another early follower of Gurdjieff and spent many, many years with him, and indeed was there with him right to the end at his deathbed. But John Bennett is a very academically capable and also very clear and careful thinker, and wanted to understand and actually write about what Gurdjieff was talking about in far greater detail and also with far greater academic coherence. And so it is very well researched, and this book, the first volume here, which he calls The Foundations of Natural Philosophy, and he talks first of all about metaphysics, epistemology, that's how we know what we know, and methodology and systematics. And before going on to talk about the dynamical world, he calls this the dramatic universe because hazard and uncertainty is absolutely essential to the functioning and the evolution of the universe. You can't have a universe without uncertainty, and therefore the suffering and all of the stuff that happens in the world. You think, why on earth is this happening? Well, I'm afraid it's because of the hazard of human uncertainty about the human behavior as well as just natural events. And anyway, that I won't go more into that. Now, the second volume goes into much more great depth about what I'm going to be teaching about, and then there's the third and fourth volumes as well. But more recently, I've come across a book, a very helpful book. I was recommended by one of the people who came across my earlier videos to do with the roots and the shoots of the Enneagram, and this was recommended to me. This is a book called Where Did the Enneagram Come From? And it's by Fátima Christlieb, a lady who again writes with great detail and academic research, trying to uncover where on earth this came from. And I was very relieved to discover that a lot of what she said corroborated what I had already put out there in my first video, but added details which I needed to include, and some 1 or 2 minor corrections too. So I'm going to update those videos. So actually, I'm going to go on to talk about the new course that I'm developing, which really is an extension or development from my older course, which I did last year. And this one I'm calling the Enneagram of Cosmic Laws, because I don't want to focus so much on the work, very narrow sort of concept of how we do this, although I include that as well. But to understand what lies behind the Enneagrams and the knowledge and the wisdom that's there that we need to put in and apply to all sorts of situations in our own life, including that of our own personal development and growth. So that's all I'm going to say in this slide and as an introduction, and I'm going to go on to talk about what I'm producing. And the first of these modules is actually an introductory module, which will be available to all publicly. And if you want to take it further, then you can sign up for it. I'm going to start doing this again through the Edinburgh International Centre for Spirituality and Peace. Hosted my first course, and we'll see where we get to, and I'll put details about it in the course description and a link in probably a comment. But anyway, so here goes. So my introductory module I'm going to entitle "What is the Enneagram and where did it come from?" My first earlier videos just was called, I think, The Roots and the Shoots of the Enneagram. But I thought it'd be worthwhile reading out to you, and I've put it on the screen here, a quotation found in Uspensky's book of what Gurdjieff said about the Enneagram, having described it a little bit and a little bit about why it is in the form that it is. So Gurdjieff said, speaking in general, it must be understood that the Enneagram is a universal symbol. All knowledge can be included in the Enneagram, and with the help of the Enneagram, it can be interpreted. And in this connection, only what a man is able to put into the Enneagram does he actually know, that is, understand. What he cannot put into the Enneagram, he does not understand. So just to comment on that, the fact that actually you would just look at the Enneagram and be completely mystified by what on earth all this. You can see the shapes that are in it, but you don't know what it means at all. So for the man who is able to make use of it, the Enneagram makes books and libraries entirely unnecessary. Well, fine, except that I needed some explanation, so I did read many books. Everything can be included and read in the Enneagram. A man can be quite alone in the desert, and he can trace the Enneagram in the sand, and in it read the eternal laws of the universe. And every time he can learn something new, something he did not know before, a fact that I would say is true in my experience as well. The Enneagram is the fundamental hieroglyph of a universal language which has as many different meanings as there are levels of men. The Enneagram is a thematic diagram of perpetual motion, that is a machine of eternal movement, but of course it is necessary to know how to read this diagram. The understanding of this symbol and the ability to make use of it give man very great power. It is a perpetual motion, and it is also the philosopher's stone of the alchemists. So that is exactly what I've been aiming to do through this course and my earlier courses too. Well, in this, the first video of the introductory module, I'll therefore be introducing the Enneagram as a symbol of 3 cosmic laws which govern everything that emerges anew and evolves in cycles, and how everything in the universe is a part of one interconnected reality. So as I said, this is the Enneagram that Gurdjieff came across in his travels and introduced to the world, but people subsequently took his original Enneagram and developed it in 2 different ways. The first is the popular and quite well-known Personality Enneagram I've mentioned before. The second is the less well-known Process Enneagram. As I said, I'm more interested in the original Enneagram of Cosmic Laws, which is a far wider application than just trying to understand different processes as well. Now, in the subsequent videos, as I said, I will delve into the possible origins of the Enneagram and how it developed. And that is where I'm indebted to Fátima Christlieb's very well researched book that I talked about earlier. So in the second video, I'm going to cover everything that from around about 3000 BCE, so 4,000–5,000 years ago, a long time ago, to the Desert Fathers in the 4th century in the Christian era. And that is really about the possible roots of the Enneagram in perennial wisdom. Now, the important thing to say at this is that none of this, the Enneagram didn't come ready-made right back then. It was basically but the wisdom, the perennial wisdom that is rooted very, very early on, and a wisdom that, incidentally, the more you understand it, and the more you understand the cutting-edge science and philosophy and cosmology and all sorts of stuff, you find actually it coheres together. So I will dip into the influences of the Chaldean oracles. That's a very early thing. Ancient Egyptian numerology, the influences of Pythagoras, the Essenes, the pre-Sufi traditions that eventually produced a Sufi Enneagram. That'll be the second video. And in the third video, I'm going to cover the period from the 4th century to the 19th century, and the way in which the Enneagram symbol was worked on and evolved during that time as a result of interaction between Sufis and mystical streams of Christianity. And I will talk about important people involved in this. So many of whom actually were persecuted by the institutional church because they were deemed to be heretical. However, as I've looked at Christianity, of course, I know it very deeply from within, and I've studied the teachings of Jesus in the original languages, especially Aramaic, which is what the language that Jesus spoke. Thanks to Neil Douglas Klotz, who has written a book called The Aramaic Jesus. So I find that actually some of the Gnostic Gospels, not all of them, but some of them, and the Aramaic version of the Gospels actually contain far more accurate understandings of really what Jesus was teaching. I occasionally dip into that in the course proper. But in the final video, which is the 4th video for the first module, I'll cover how Gurdjieff discovered the Enneagram and how those who learned of it from him developed their own understanding and passed it on right down to the way that the Enneagram of Personalities was developed. So in this first module, which I've entitling, and this particular upgrade of the course, What is Man? There's a psalm that begins, what is man that thou art mindful of him, but yet you have made him a little lower than the angels. Well, might just mention that at the beginning of the course too, but I want to point out that the Personality Enneagram and the Process Enneagram, although they're complete, they start from two different starting points. They're two different ways of approaching the Enneagram completely, but they can complement each other, and I explain why I think that's possible, although I'll be focusing on the process. And then I will be going into how Gurdjieff talked rather disparagingly about human beings being just machines, but that was because he saw the way in which we operate and function mechanically, automatically. And this is, of course, when you think of the personality, it's because we're driven by the ego passions and the fixations, which are patterns of thought, of ways that we think about the world and perceive reality that underlie it, which are all kind of defense mechanisms as well. But the human therefore functions like as a machine mechanically, Then he talks about the human being as a three-brained being. Actually, of course, anatomically, that's been proven to be the fact too, and he was scientifically understood that as a medical practitioner of his day, that humans have three brains, as it were, different, so that the more primitive brain of the reptilian brain, the brain that controls the emotional side of the limbic system, and then the cortex and the cognitive center. And then we'll talk about something of the way in which our three-brained worlds depict the world for us. In other words, how we perceive reality, when actually we don't perceive reality. We only perceive what is there on the computer screen of our brains, as it were, which is quite different from what actually is the real world. But and so I developed that further to talk about three centers of intelligence, which of course comes into the Personality Enneagram as well. but is introduced in a slightly different way, and I will use a very good analogy of a hackney carriage to talk about the three different centers of intelligence. Now, an important aspect of this first module is to talk about the difference between personality and essence, and that is understood in a particular way, which I will explain. And then we start talking about how to stop being a machine and introduce Gurdjieff's what Gurdjieff called the fourth way, because the other three ways, which is the way of the fakir, the way of the monk, and the way of the yogi. He was keen to be able to help people to develop and evolve to become who they really are in the context of their daily life. And anyway, I'll mention that in more detail when we get to the course. And a foundational practice of self-observation and attention, paying attention to stuff and to what's going on in and around us. And then I think it's quite important for me to relate what I talk about to Roberto Assagioli's egg diagram of the human psyche, and he describes he describes three kinds of subconsciousness, if you like. There's the lower subconscious, the middle subconscious, and the higher up subconscious. The reason for that is important is that so much attention is actually paid on the lower subconscious in psychotherapy and psychology today, that we forget that actually one of the things that transpersonal psychology certainly brings us is the awareness of a higher level of subconscious. We're not aware of the stuff that's coming from above, as it were. So then I'll be talking about developing an awareness in our three centers, that in order to connect with what Gurdjieff calls the causal mind, or our higher and true self, connected to the divine mind, really. And then finally, I just conclude with a brief comment about the value of doing the work as part of a group rather than just on your own. So that's the first module. In the second module, I begin to introduce the cosmic laws, of which there are three. And so in the first part of the second module, I introduce the law of one. But before I do so, I talk about myth and symbol and how they relate to our emotional and intellectual centers, and therefore how this symbol of the Enneagram speaks to our intellectual center. Whereas the stories and things we tell each other, the myths that are actually much more aimed at the emotional center, as those of us who read novels and books and things will understand, as well as those of us who go to films. It's the stories that elicit the emotions, but the symbol itself is meant to help us to understand what that is all about. So the circle represents the law of one, and that's basically the law of sacred interconnection, and I will talk about that in not too much detail, but the law of one, I will then show how this relates to contemporary science and how contemporary science understands the universe and the world in which we live and our interconnection there, and how this coheres with ancient wisdom. And then I will go into several other meanings of the circle. And as Gurdjieff said, there are many, many levels of meaning and many different. I mean, the symbol is I think they call polyvalent. It has many, many possible meanings. But I delve into some of the ones which are important in relationship to our human development there. And including a dip into, I think, something to do with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in Genesis 2:3, and what that might mean. Now, well, in the second part of the second module, I introduce the law of three, which is a law that governs how something new comes into being. And I give various examples of that law of functioning in the physical world, before I go on to talk about its significance for politics and relationships, So between human people and human parties, political parties. Then how the law of three functions in our human psyche, to do with three fundamental laws and how grace comes in, a very important third force I'll talk about. And the law of three and the fundamental practices and some three fundamental practices for personal growth, all of which can be applied very readily to the Personality Enneagram. Well, in the third and final part of the second module, I go on to talk about the law of three and the Holy Trinity, an important, because Gurdjieff said that actually the third force of the law of three is it has something to do with the Trinity. And I will talk about where we find the law, a Trinitarian concept of God in the ancient world. It's not just unique and first time in Christianity, by the way, although it has a unique way of understanding. Christianity has a unique way of understanding the interrelationship between the persons of the Trinity, the divine essence in three persons. So I then talk about the law of three in endless unity before time and space and the Big Bang, and then how that therefore led on to the creation of the world, because the law of three is all about the law of how something new comes into being. And not only the world, but of course a human being as well. And then, so the law of three and the creation of a human being. And then there are three elements of aspects to human beings, three different levels, if you like. There's will, being, and function, which I will go on to explain how those relate to the law of three and what they are all about. Function is what you do in the world. Being is what you are, how you are in the world, and will is what gives a sense of direction to how you are and what you do, and that's very important. So I'll then conclude the whole module with a lovely poem from the Rig Veda, which I found very inspiring. Well, in the third module, I introduced the law of seven, which is actually a very much more complicated law than the law of three. And so in the first part, I just talk about what it is. It's a law that governs how anything that exists already develops and evolves through steps and stages which cannot be short-circuited. And then I will say that the whole concept comes from the mathematics of music, which is why Gurdjieff called it the law of octaves. And I explain why he called it the law of octaves. Not only octaves singular, but octaves plural, because to develop fully, you have three different octaves, each complementing one another. It's like a sort of harmonious event that has to happen. And it's therefore a process that takes place both in time and outside of time, with the circle representing, if you like, what happens in the process around in time, the clock time, function time, and then the crisscrossing lines, that is actually a process that takes place outside of time, or more accurately, probably in eternity time. Eternity is actually timeless, but it's there all the time, as it were. And I will talk about being time later. There's a difference between function time and being time and will time. So it's there are three kinds of time. Oh yes, that's what I come on to talking about next. The function time, being time, and will time, and I explain what the difference is, and we're usually only aware of the function time, the clock time, and we're driven by it too. Anyway, I then need to explain what each note of the octave signifies. This is drawing very much on the work of John Bennett, who worked this out in great detail. So to understand that underlies everything that you you need to understand about the process. And then I've talked about the significance of the arrow lines of the hexad, what that's all about, the movement along the arrow lines. And then finally, I give two practical examples, or applications, I should say, of the law of seven in practice. So you can apply it to setting up a business. And I use the idea of setting up a restaurant as one example, and then creating a piece of art. It could be a piece of literature, it could be anything. But in this particular instance, I use the idea of the great big pottery throwdown and producing a piece of pottery to illustrate the point, the process. Well, in the second part of the third module, I show how the law of seven can be applied to the process of human awakening. And before I do so, I need to explain about the very significant fact that if you look at the Enneagram, it's actually in two halves, that there are two halves to it. If you put a central dividing line down the middle, you'll find that one half mirror is a mirror image of the other. But the central dividing line is actually very significant, running from the 9 at the top through to the division between the 4 and the 5 at the bottom. And so I need to explain what that's all about, and then I go on to talk about the Enneagram, applying it to the process of personal growth and development, and how that can happen in a number of different situations. So for example, you can apply it to the process of becoming free from as an alcoholic or a drug addict or anything like that. But it may be just you're seeking to develop, to grow, to develop yourself spiritually, to grow as a person, become who you want to be, who you are created to be, as well as who you want to be. So the Enneagram, therefore, I finish up by talking about it as a symbol of perpetual motion, and explain why that is so. The fourth module is also divided into two parts, and this is about the Enneagram, applying the Enneagram to the process of human growth and development. So in the first part, I will talk about the Enneagram and levels of psycho-spiritual intelligence, and it's actually based on I refer a lot to Ken Wilber's work in his book Integral Spirituality. And although he is talking about levels of spiritual intelligence, I can't separate the spiritual from the psychological. The two are so intertwined. But anyway, basically, I spend the first part of this video showing how the Enneagram can apply in the stages of an individual human growth and development, the growth and development of an individual person. And in the second part of it, I talk about the Enneagram as a framework for understanding the evolution of humanity, and why we have reached a particular crisis point now, and therefore what on earth are we going to do to overcome the sticking point at which we seem to have arrived at, which is impacting the world so much, both climate change and famine and inequality and wars and all the rest of it. In the second part of Module 4, I talk about the Enneagram and levels of consciousness. So I need to explain what these levels of consciousness are, and how we develop these levels of and we grow up and become more and more conscious, if you like. And then I need to explain the difference between a subjective and objective consciousness and subjective and objective knowledge, which Gurdjieff made a point of saying that is very different from one another, and why we need to know that. And then understanding personality and the difference between the ego personality and the higher or true self. This again relates very well to personality Enneagram stuff, although I don't describe the personalities in any way, the personality types, and they each have their own growth path and journey. And then I need to talk about levels of being and applying that to the process Enneagram. That's quite a complicated piece. But media of communication for the different levels of consciousness also comes into it. and the importance of developing an awareness of posture and movement in order to affect change in any one center. Now, this is again something that was unique to Gurdjieff and was one of the reasons why he developed his dance movements as a spiritual practice. So that's the end of module 4. Moving on to the 5th module, I talk about something that Gurdjieff called buffering and what the consequences of that are, which is really all to do with how he lost touch with real consciousness. And then to explain the detail of that, I need to talk about how the energy lines connecting the 1 points 1, 4, 2, 8, 5 and 7 were meant to function originally, as it were. We were designed to function that way. But then why it is that we develop this capacity, and of necessity develop the capacity to buffer. In buffering is to do with preventing us from feeling too much shock. When you bump, when you have a buffer on a train, it's to minimize the sort of sense of joltedness and shock. And that's just to enable us to be able to live, function in everyday life comfortably. But 3 brain beings that Gurdjieff talked about don't start life as a new machine. We're already from almost from get-go. We find that we acquire habits and the personality side of ourselves, which overlays the essence of who we really are, and that's therefore things start going wrong because of that. And I illustrate that in terms of buffers, what that means for an unawakened human being and the consequences. We then move on to look at the difference between conscience and consciousness. Gurdjieff's focus was very much more on gaining consciousness rather than on sort of pricking our conscience. Our conscience can play all sorts of tricks with us, actually. And they can be misinformed by all sorts of wrong teaching. How to destroy buffers and the subtle joy of awakening is what I move on to. And then I talk about buffers as an essential defense mechanisms in the early part of life. And then an important distinction between morality and buffers. And then the Enneagram, and I illustrate ending up talking about what this actually means in practice for in an unawakened human being, unawakened 3-brained being, and how it actually works. So that's important. I give a practical example from a real lived situation. Then Gurdjieff called the buffers Kunda buffer in Beelzebub's Tales, and I have a look at why he called it that, and then have a fresh look at the Genesis 2:3 myth to do with the snake and the serpents, and the coiled around serpent. So that might offer a different interpretation from what we are traditionally told. So coming on to module 6, which I've entitled From Dust to Gold Dust, the Alchemy of the Law of 7. And in order to understand this, we need to start off by talking about energy and energy levels and energy bodies and what it's all about. So I think I forget who it was. Energy is described by many physicists as the movement from potential to form. Then I talk about levels of energy. I don't just mean about how we feel energy. You can be a low energy level in the body and a higher energy level, so ready to go up mountains, etc. I'm not meaning that. I'm talking very much more about the fundamental concept of energy that functions in the universe at different levels, from the gross to the very much more refined, and then to the spiritual energies and higher energies. And then it is necessary to understand that we are more than just the physical human being. We have energy bodies too. Some people might understand that in terms of the astral bodies, but people have auras and stuff like that some people are sensitive to and can conceive, and why that's significant. And then I talk about this in relation to the centers and the chakras and how that comes into it. And then finally, I end up by talking about the fact that we have three different kinds of food for our three different kinds of body: the physical food, the emotional food, and the, if you like, the impressions octave for the higher bodies. Anyway, that is what I finish up in this particular first part of the sixth module with. Then in the second part of the sixth module, I dive into the actual alchemical process of digestion itself. And so here we have to understand the three octaves that I spoke about in an earlier stage of the course, and the fact that we have a food octave and there is an alchemical process that takes place. Well, it's a digestion process, an actual real digestion process in the physical body. And but just as we also have take in the air, the breath, the ruach, the spirit, there is an alchemical process that takes place in the emotional body. So it's all to do with refining energies and producing higher and higher energies. So the higher energies in the air octave, and then how I go back to self-observation, which is very, very important, but I go a little bit more detail in this and what it means to remember oneself, which Gurdjieff talked about a lot, and what that means. And then I say how this process that takes place is always with a divine will, attention, and love, and the energy shocks that have to happen. That's the input of extra energy at certain points to get us past sticking points and hazards. And then I will talk about the impressions octave, the food for the digested in the intellectual center, and the impressions octave in the alchemical process in the intellectual body. So I finish up by talking about the I am is the path of transformation, referring to a very well-known but unfortunately mistranslated, misunderstood verse in John's Gospel that Jesus is quoted as saying, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And that's my final point for that module. Now in the final module, module 7, I want to try and tie up some loose ends. So in the first part, I deal with the important matter of how to separate and transform negative emotions. This is extremely important and actually very practical, and it will help us to deal with that. And then the second part, I deal with how the energy flows along the hexad lines in the three octaves of digestion, which I didn't mention very much in the previous module. And interestingly enough, of course, what you have is that the do note of the octave starts in the second second octave, which is the emotional octave. It starts at point 3, and therefore the apex of the triangle starts at point 3 and then moves round. So the do is at point 3. The do is always point 3 and point 9, and then there's a sticking point at point 6 and another sticking point that gets to the further one round to the point. Sorry, the sticking point at point 3 and a sticking point at point 6 as well. I'll explain in earlier videos. So there's a kind of rotation. Well, this will all seem a little bit strange until you understand the earlier modules, which is why you actually have to take this course in order. It builds one module builds upon another. And the only thing left to say is that for those who want to participate in this course, which I'm still going to be updating the material that's offered through the Edinburgh International Centre for Spirituality and Peace, with a more up-to-date description that is on their website in the events page. Whether or not there'll be another live course is also a possibility. I haven't set anything in motion yet. And those who are unable to join live can always watch the videos. And with each video, I send a PDF document that has icons of all the individual videos that you can simply click on to connect you with the YouTube video itself. And then also a description of an outline of the content, which I've just more or less described in this video itself. But then beyond that, offering some meditative practices. I recommend that we begin each session with a meditation practice of some kind, and also something that you can do in your own time during the intervening periods, but when you've and then finally some reflection questions that you can work on yourself as well. So all of that is included in the course. So anyway, bye for now, and if you're curious, I will give some detail about where you can link in to the information, probably put it in a later comment, because I need to update this with the Edinburgh International Centre for Spirituality and Peace first. So bye and God bless.